She built a hidden bedroom beneath her cabin until the worst blizzard made it her only shelter. Nobody knew that beneath the quiet cabin near Bitterroot Creek, a woman was digging against death itself. From the outside, Sarah Hutchkins' home looked no different than the others scattered across the Montana Valley. The pine logs were weathered and gray. A narrow chimney sent up a thin ribbon of smoke each morning. A small woodshed leaned against the north wall, stacked with split timber that would never feel like enough. Snow rested along the roof edges like it did on every other homestead that winter. Nothing about it warned anyone that under the floorboards, a hidden room was taking shape. It was November of 1887, and winter had come early. The cold did not arrive gently that year. It settled into the valley like something heavy and permanent. By late October, frost clung to the inside of cabin windows. The Bitterroot Creek froze along its edges. The wind moved through the trees with a sharp voice that carried at night. Sarah was 32 years old and already carrying the weight of a lifetime. Her husband had died in the spring when a pine trunk snapped wrong during a logging cut. The accident was quick. The loss was not. He left behind debts at the general store, a modest cabin, and 2 children who still asked when their father was coming home. Emma was 8, quiet and watchful. Daniel was 5, small for his age and prone to coughing when the air turned cold. The cabin measured 14 feet by 18. It stood 6 inches above the ground on cedar posts. The logs were packed tight with clay and straw. The stone fireplace drew smoke well enough if the wind cooperated. By frontier standards, it was solid. But solid did not mean warm. The cold did not creep through the walls first. It came from below. Each morning after late October, frost formed along the inside of the floorboards. When Emma stepped out of bed, her feet recoiled from the icy planks. Daniel's breath clouded in the dim light before sunrise. Even when the fire burned through the night, the air near the floor stayed sharp and biting. The crawl space under the raised cabin turned into a tunnel for wind. At night, gusts screamed beneath the boards and pulled heat away faster than the fire could replace it. Water left in the wash basin froze solid before dawn. The children slept wrapped in quilts near the hearth, yet still woke shaking. Sarah tried every suggestion the neighbors offered. She packed straw beneath the cabin. She hung canvas along the foundation to block drafts. She burned more wood than she could afford. She fed the fire every 2 hours through the night until her eyes burned from smoke and lack of sleep. Nothing stopped the cold from rising through the floor. By mid-November, Daniel's cough deepened. It settled in his chest and lingered through the day. Emma's fingers turned pale when she carried wood inside. Sarah began waking even before the wind rattled the shutters, afraid the fire might have died while she slept. One night, as the wind pressed hard against the cabin walls, Sarah sat staring at the frost creeping along the boards near her children's bed. She listened to Daniel breathe in short, uneven pulls. That was the night she made her decision. She would not fight the cold from above. She would go beneath it. Before dawn the next morning, she moved the small woven rug in the northwest corner of the cabin. She pried up 3 floorboards under the children's bed. Below them lay hard-packed soil, frozen at the surface. She picked up a shovel and began to dig. She was not building a root cellar. She was not making a storm pit. She was creating a sleeping room beneath the cabin where the wind could not reach, where the earth held steady warmth even when the air above turned deadly cold. She told no one. Not because she wanted secrecy, but because she did not want doubt. She did not want to hear why it would fail, or why it was improper for a woman to dig under her own home. She wanted her children alive in the spring. The first inches were stubborn and frozen. The soil came up heavy and stiff, but 8 inches down, the earth softened. It felt different there, less angry, less sharp. Sarah worked in the early morning and late at night. When the children slept or played outside for short moments in the weak sun, she dug. She carried soil out in a canvas sack and spread it thin across her garden so no one would see a growing mound. She had thought through every detail. The room would be 8 feet long and 6 feet wide, just tall enough for her to sit upright. She would line the walls with river stone gathered during summer so the earth would not collapse. A narrow ladder would lead down. A small ventilation pipe would angle up through the foundation, hidden like simple drainage. She understood something many men ignored. 5 feet below ground, the temperature did not change with the wind. In Montana, that meant the earth stayed near 45 to 50 degrees, even when the air above dropped far below zero. She did not speak in numbers. She called it staying below the wind. 3 weeks passed. Her hands blistered and then hardened. Her back ached, but the space grew deeper. By early December, she could stand inside the hollow she had carved beneath her cabin. She began stacking stone. Rounded river rocks formed the walls, dry stacked and wedged tight. Smaller stones filled the gaps. Pine needles and bark packed between stone and soil trapped air and added protection. She built a raised platform for bedding and fitted the ventilation pipe carefully through the side. When she finished, she replaced the floorboards and covered the small trapdoor with the woven rug. From above, nothing had changed. From below, it was quiet. One night, when the temperature dropped close to zero, Sarah carried a candle down into the hidden room and closed the trapdoor above her. She waited. The air felt still. It did not bite her face. Her breath did not hang thick in front of her. It was not warm like summer, but it was safe. She climbed back up and watched her children sleep on the cabin floor near the fire. Winter had only begun, and she knew the real test was still coming. Snow began falling 3 days later, slow at first, then steady. By mid-December, the valley lay under a white silence that looked peaceful from a distance. Smoke rose from chimneys. Children's footprints marked paths between cabins. The Bitterroot settlement appeared calm. Inside the Hutchkins cabin, the cold still pressed hard against the walls. Sarah had finished the underground room, but she had not yet moved the children into it full time. She waited for a night that would prove whether her work was wisdom or foolishness. The fire burned low and careful. Her woodpile was not large. Every log she placed on the hearth felt like coins slipping through her fingers. Neighbors began noticing the signs of digging. Old Mr. Calloway passed one evening as Sarah spread thin soil across her frozen garden. He paused near the fence and asked if she had trouble with drainage under the house. Sarah answered that she was improving the foundation. He studied her face, nodded once, and walked on. 2 women from the church stopped by with a jar of preserved apples. They glanced at the disturbed soil and asked if she was building a root cellar so late in the season. Sarah smiled softly and said something like that. The women exchanged quiet looks. The ground would freeze hard soon. Digging now seemed unwise. At the general store, a clerk named Horace leaned across the counter and mentioned he had heard she was working beneath her cabin. He warned her that floors could sag and posts could shift. He spoke as though he were offering kindness. Sarah paid for lamp oil and candles and left without explaining. No one mocked her directly, but no one believed in what she was doing either. On December 18th, the temperature fell to 12 degrees above zero before sunset. By night, it dropped lower. That was when Sarah made her move. She waited until the children finished their supper of cornmeal and dried apples. She carried the bedding toward the corner of the cabin and lifted the woven rug. Emma stared at the open square in the floor. It looked dark and uncertain. Daniel stepped closer and peered down. The air rising from below did not sting his face. Sarah lowered the ladder and lit the oil lamp. She told them it was a new sleeping place for winter nights. Emma hesitated only a moment before climbing down. Daniel followed with curiosity instead of fear. The stone walls glowed softly in lamplight. The air felt calm. No wind moved through the space. No boards rattled. The earth held everything steady. Sarah checked the small thermometer she had hung on a nail in the stone. It read 58 degrees. Above them, in the cabin, even with the fire burning steady, the air hovered near 50. They lay down on the raised platform together that first night. The children pressed close, listening to the quiet. Emma whispered that she could not hear the wind. Daniel said it smelled like stone after rain. They slept without shaking. When Sarah climbed up before dawn to feed the fire, frost lined the inside of the cabin walls. The water bucket had formed a thin crust of ice. The wind howled beneath the boards like an animal searching for weakness. Below, the underground room remained calm and unchanged. Sarah did not speak of it. She simply began moving the children down each night once the sun fell. The storm arrived on January 11th. It began as light snow drifting sideways across the valley. By afternoon, the wind strengthened. By nightfall, visibility vanished. Snow drove hard against cabin walls. The sky darkened until even the trees disappeared beyond a few yards. By midnight, the temperature dropped below zero. It did not rise again. On the second day, it reached 18 below. On the third, 24 below. Wind tore through the settlement, piling snow 4 feet high against doors. Drifts climbed toward rooftops. Paths between cabins disappeared. Firewood stacks vanished under ice. Chimneys clogged with blowing snow. Fires smoked and struggled for air. Green wood refused to burn clean. People began breaking apart broken chairs and fence posts to keep flames alive. Inside her cabin, Sarah watched her woodpile shrink. Even with careful feeding, the fire could not hold steady warmth. Ice formed on the inside of the window edges. Frost crept along the seams between logs. The air near the ceiling felt warmer, but near the floor it dropped sharp and bitter. On the 8th night of the storm, the thermometer inside the cabin read 38 degrees. Sarah looked at the last of her split logs stacked near the hearth. She looked at Emma's pale hands and Daniel's thin shoulders. She banked the fire low, just enough to keep the chimney warm and prevent smoke from backing into the cabin. Then she wrapped the children in every blanket she owned. They climbed down together. Emma carried the oil lamp. Daniel gripped Sarah's skirt as the wind screamed outside. When the trap door closed above them, the sound of the storm vanished like a door shutting against danger. The underground room felt still. The thermometer read 53 degrees. Outside it was 26 below with wind. They stayed below. For 4 days the blizzard raged across Bitterroot Creek. Snow buried doors. Some families could not open their cabins without digging. Fires failed. Smoke filled rooms. Children cried through the night from cold and fear. Twice each day Sarah climbed the ladder to tend the fire briefly. Each time, the cold struck her lungs so sharply she had to brace herself. Frost coated her hair within minutes. She fed the flames quickly, checked the chimney, and returned below. Within moments, warmth settled back into her hands. They ate dried apples and cold cornbread. They spoke quietly. Emma read from a worn book by lamplight without numb fingers. Daniel's cough did not return. They slept. Above them, winter tore at the valley with full force. Below, the earth held steady. On the morning, the wind finally weakened. The silence felt heavier than the storm. Snow stood in deep walls around the cabin. The chimney still gave off thin smoke. Sarah climbed up slowly and opened the door just enough to see daylight reflecting off endless white. The settlement was beginning to dig out, and soon they would notice something that did not make sense. By afternoon, figures moved slowly through the snow between cabins. Men shoveled narrow paths. Women carried buckets of ash and broken wood. The storm had passed, but it had not left quietly. It had taken wood piles, cracked shutters, and stolen sleep from every family in the valley. Margaret Briggs was the first to reach Sarah's door. She carried a jar of thin broth wrapped in cloth. Her face looked older than it had a week before. Her hands were red and swollen from cold. She expected to find desperation inside the Hutchkins cabin. She expected frostbitten fingers and children coughing near a dying fire. Instead, she stepped into a room that felt steady. The fire burned low but alive. The air, though cool, did not bite. Emma sat at the small table drawing shapes on scrap paper. Daniel stacked smooth stones in a careful line on the floor. Margaret stared at them. She asked how much wood Sarah had burned during the storm. Sarah answered honestly. less than she thought she would need. Margaret's husband had burned through nearly 3 cords. He had taken apart an old bench for kindling. Their youngest child had swollen feet from the cold. The broth in Margaret's hands had come from the last of their dried meat. Her eyes moved across the cabin, searching for some hidden stove or thick insulation she had missed. Then she noticed the woven rug in the corner. 2 days later, Jacob Stern, the carpenter who had once laughed at Sarah's digging, came by under the excuse of checking her foundation. He was a broad man, with rough hands and pride that usually filled a doorway before he did. He removed his hat and stood awkwardly near the hearth. He asked how she had kept the fire from dying. Sarah did not answer with numbers or arguments. She moved the rug aside and lifted the trap door. Jacob leaned down and peered into the quiet space below. The stone walls caught the light. The air rising from the opening felt steady, not sharp. The small ladder rested against the edge. The bedding platform remained neat. Jacob climbed down without waiting to be invited. He stood upright in the room and ran his hand along the stone. He felt the calm in the air. He looked at the thermometer hanging from a nail. 51 degrees. Above them, the cabin read 39. He climbed back up slowly. He did not laugh. Word spread the way it always did in small settlements. Quiet at first, then steady. By the end of the week, Horace from the general store came with questions instead of warnings. He asked how deep she had dug, what stone she used, how the air moved without smoke collecting. Sarah showed him the angled pipe. She explained simply. 5 feet down, the earth stays the same. Stone holds heat, wind steals it. That was all. Within days, the sound of shovels striking frozen ground began echoing through Bitterroot Creek. Jacob Stern was the first to begin. He measured carefully beneath his own cabin and marked out a space close to Sarah's design. Riverstone walls, dry stacked and tight, pine bark packed between stone and soil. A narrow ladder, a hidden door beneath a rug. His wife watched with doubt at first. When the space was finished and they slept there for the first night, she wept quietly from relief. The room held warmth without the stove roaring through the night. The silence felt like protection. Margaret Briggs could not dig directly under her cabin. The posts sat too shallow. Instead, she cut into the north side of her home and built a half-buried room 3 feet into the earth. Stone walls rose along the sides. A roof of timber and packed soil sealed the top. It was smaller than Sarah's, but it worked. Her children stopped waking with numb hands. The change moved through the settlement without meetings or announcements. No one declared it new. No one claimed invention. They simply saw the difference. Families who had burned furniture during the storm now burned less wood. Chimneys cracked less from constant overfiring. Fewer cabins filled with choking smoke as people pushed stoves beyond safety. Most important, children slept through the night. By late January, 7 families had built some version of the underground sleeping space. Some combined it with root cellars. Others carved narrow chambers only large enough for beds. Each design shifted with soil type, stone availability, and water levels. The idea remained the same. Let the earth do the work. The pastor mentioned it during Sunday service, not as a miracle, but as a lesson. Sometimes wisdom is older than pride. Sometimes survival requires looking down instead of building higher. Jacob Stern stood in front of the congregation and admitted he had been wrong to doubt Sarah. He spoke plainly. He said he had laughed when he should have listened. Sarah did not stand. She did not speak long. She only nodded and said it worked for her children. The winter continued, but fear no longer ruled the nights the way it had before. When storms rolled across the valley, families moved below the wind. Fires burned lower. Woodpiles lasted longer. The settlement felt different. Calmer. By February, travelers passing through Bitterroot Creek began noticing the pattern. Smoke rose thin and steady from chimneys, even during sharp, cold snaps. Cabins that once struggled through winter now stood quiet and controlled. One traveler from Wyoming stopped when he saw Jacob digging beneath his barn. He asked what he was building. Jacob answered without shame, a sleeping room below ground. The man listened carefully. Ideas travel faster than wagons when they carry proof. By the time the snow began to soften at the edges in early March, the underground rooms were no longer secrets. They were simply part of winter life. But winter was not finished with Bitterroot Creek, and the cold still had one more lesson to teach. March came with false hope. For a few days, the snow softened along the edges of the valley. Water dripped from roof lines in slow rhythm. The Bitterroot Creek cracked and shifted under thinning ice. People spoke of spring, as if saying the word might make it arrive faster. Then the sky changed. On March 17th, dark clouds rolled down from the mountains without warning. The air turned sharp again. By evening, the temperature fell faster than anyone expected. Wind returned with a force that felt angry, not tired. It was not as long as the January storm. It was worse. Snow fell heavy and wet at first, then turned dry and sharp as the cold deepened. The wind did not just push against cabins. It roared across the valley floor and struck walls from every direction. Drifts formed within hours. Doors froze shut. Chimneys clogged before dawn. Families who had relaxed too soon scrambled back into winter routines. But something had changed since January. This time, when the wind rose, people did not panic. They moved below. Sarah felt the shift in the air before the snow thickened. She had learned the signs. The silence before the gusts. The way smoke bent flat along the roof line. She banked her fire early. She checked the trap door. She lowered fresh blankets into the underground room before the temperature fell too far. Emma did not hesitate now. Daniel carried the oil lamp carefully down the ladder. The space felt familiar, not strange. It smelled faintly of stone and pine bark. When the trapdoor closed, the storm became distant. Above them, the wind struck the cabin hard enough to rattle dishes. Snow slammed against shutters. The temperature outside dropped to 20 below by midnight. Inside the underground room, it held steady at 52 degrees. Sarah no longer climbed up twice a day to fight the fire. She had learned to let it rest. The chimney needed only enough warmth to stay clear. The earth below did the rest. Across the settlement, other families followed the same pattern. Jacob Stern's family moved below without discussion. Margaret Briggs gathered her children into her half-buried room before the worst of the wind hit. Even Horace from the store, who had never built anything larger than a storage pit, finished a small chamber under his back wall just days before the storm. The valley that once feared winter now waited it out. On the second night of the March storm, a sharp crack split the air near the center of the settlement. One of the older cabins lost part of its roof under heavy drift. The family inside had already moved to their underground room earlier that evening. They heard the crash above them, but remained safe. That moment changed everything. Before Sarah's hidden bedroom, that collapse might have meant frostbite or worse. Now, it meant repair in spring. When the wind finally died down after 3 days, the damage above ground looked severe. Snow buried fences. One barn leaned hard to the east. Several chimneys cracked under pressure. But no children were sick from smoke. No hands were lost to frostbite. No one had burned their last chair in desperation. The underground rooms had done what walls and stoves alone could not. When neighbors gathered once more to clear paths and check roofs, there was a quiet understanding between them. They were not just surviving winter anymore. They were adapting to it. Jacob approached Sarah as she shoveled snow from her doorway. He did not joke this time. He asked if she had ever thought about reinforcing the underground walls with timber beams for added strength. Sarah listened. She nodded. She said stone had held well so far, but extra support would not hurt. Margaret suggested widening ventilation pipes slightly to allow better airflow during long stays. Horace mentioned lining the floor with split cedar to reduce dampness. The idea that began as one woman's quiet act of desperation had become shared knowledge. They were no longer copying Sarah. They were improving the design together. By late March, as true thaw finally arrived, the valley looked battered but not broken. Snow melted into thick mud. Creek water rose and carried ice chunks downstream. The settlement stood. More important, the people stood stronger than before. Sarah looked at her children one evening as they played near the creek. Their cheeks were red from fresh air, not cold. Daniel's cough had not returned all winter. Emma's fingers were strong and steady. The hidden bedroom beneath her cabin was no longer only hers. It had become a way of thinking. But change rarely stays quiet forever. Beyond Bitterroot Creek, travelers had begun carrying stories of earth-sheltered sleeping rooms that saved wood and saved lives. And those stories were about to travel much farther than Sarah ever expected. Spring of 1888 did not feel like victory. It felt like proof. When the snow finally melted from the valley floor, Bitterroot Creek ran high and fast. Mud covered boots. Fences needed repair. Roof shingles had to be replaced. But the settlement stood with fewer losses than any winter before it. No children had died. No families had fled. No one had burned their home just to survive the cold. The underground rooms had held. Sarah did not speak of it as invention. She returned to planting her garden, mending clothes, and stacking what firewood she could gather for the next winter. The trapdoor stayed in place beneath the woven rug, simple and quiet. But the idea did not stay quiet. By summer, a man from a nearby settlement in western Wyoming rode through Bitterroot Creek. He had heard of cabins that stayed warm without roaring fires. He had heard of families sleeping beneath their floors during blizzards. He stopped at Sarah's cabin. He did not laugh when she showed him the ladder and the stone walls. He measured the depth with his own hands. He felt the steady air and nodded slowly. He said winters in his valley were worse. Sarah answered the way she always did. The ground is the same everywhere. Only the digging is different. He rode away with more than a story. Over the next 2 years, similar underground sleeping rooms appeared across parts of Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. Some were deep like Sarah's. Others were half buried along hillsides. Some used stone. Others used timber and packed earth. The shape changed. The principle stayed. Let the earth hold the heat. By the winter of 1889, Bitterroot Creek was no longer afraid of storms. When wind rose and snow darkened the sky, families moved below without panic. Wood piles lasted longer. Chimneys smoked less. Children slept without fear. Jacob Stern began reinforcing underground rooms with stronger beams and tighter stonework. Margaret Briggs perfected her half-buried design along the north wall of her cabin. Even Horace built a larger chamber beneath his store, using it to protect goods from freezing and to shelter overnight travelers during storms. The settlement grew steadier with each passing winter. Sarah's children grew with it. Emma learned to stack stone with careful hands. She understood how gaps trapped air and how tight walls held warmth. When she married years later and moved to Idaho, she built her own cabin with a hidden room beneath it before her first winter arrived. Daniel became a stonemason. He worked on barns and small public buildings near Missoula. Without speaking of his mother's winter, he incorporated earth-shelter designs wherever he could. To him, it was not innovation. It was common sense. Sarah remarried in 1894. Her new husband, a quiet ranch hand, did not question the trap door beneath the rug. The first time he climbed down during a storm, he ran his hand along the stone and smiled. He said it was warmer than any house he had known growing up. The hidden bedroom remained part of the cabin long after it stopped being secret. Years later, when people spoke of the hard winter of 1887, they no longer spoke only of wind and loss. They spoke of the season the valley learned to look downward instead of upward for shelter. Sarah never claimed credit. She never called it invention. She had simply watched her children shiver and decided the wind would not decide their fate. The earth had always held steady warmth 5 feet below. People had lived in dugouts and pit houses long before Montana was a territory. Somewhere along the way, frontier pride had forgotten that lesson. Sarah remembered it. When others built thicker walls and burned more wood, she dug. When fear rose with the wind, she stayed below it. The numbers spoke for themselves. While others burned 2 or 3 cords of wood in a single storm, she used less than half. While frost crept across cabin walls, her children slept in steady air near 55 degrees. It was not comfort she found beneath her floor. It was survival. By the early 1890s, earth-sheltered spaces were no longer strange in parts of the West. Agricultural agents recommended partial earth protection for barns and storage sheds. Builders began factoring wind and ground temperature into designs. The lesson had traveled far beyond Bitterroot Creek, but in that small Montana valley, the change had begun with one woman lifting 3 floorboards before dawn. One quiet decision on a frozen night. One shovel striking hard soil. Sometimes the strongest shelter is not built higher. Sometimes it waits beneath your feet. If this story moved you, share your thoughts below and follow for more emotional Wild West stories.